In the 1970s, Illinois felt like two Americas at once, a state of contrast. Chicago's skyline climbed higher every year under Daley's iron rule, while cornfields downstate stretched unchanged. Each side was quietly sure it defined the heart of the state. Today, few remember how power, ambition, and pride shaped daily life, depending on which Illinois you called home. What did it really feel like to live inside that divide? Chicago in the 1970s ran on a kind of clockwork, visible in the morning crush of commuters pouring into the Loop, the steady pulse of traffic along LaSalle and State, the endless rows of buses and cabs circling the business district. Richard J. Daley was mayor for over 2 decades, and his influence could be felt in every pothole patched, every trash can emptied on schedule, every streetlight that switched on at dusk. Ward offices handled complaints with a phone call or a handshake, and city jobs often depended on the right connection. For many, it was a city that worked, at least if you knew who to ask. The Loop was the heart of it all. Office workers in polyester suits and sensible shoes hurried beneath the shadow of the L, briefcases in hand, moving with purpose past newsstands and coffee counters. The city's arteries, streets, rails, and sidewalks fed into this core, humming from dawn until well after dark. O'Hare Airport, already among the busiest in the world, sent a constant stream of travelers into downtown, reinforcing Chicago's role as a crossroads for the nation. Freight trains rumbled through sprawling yards just blocks from skyscrapers, their horns echoing across the cityscape. One longtime commuter remembered, every morning the train would roll into Union Station right on the dot. You could set your watch by it. The city felt like a machine, sometimes impersonal, but always moving. In neighborhoods, block clubs and precinct captains kept things orderly, while downtown the machinery of government and business ran with a kind of practiced efficiency. Chicago's power was felt most in its routines, predictable, relentless, and for many reassuring. Steel and glass changed the city's face in the 1970s, pushing Chicago's ambitions skyward. Day after day, cranes crawled above the streets, their booms swinging steel beams into place. The John Hancock Center, finished in 1969, already stood as a dark, angular exclamation on the skyline. But it was the Sears Tower that drew every gaze upward, a new giant climbing higher with each sunrise. By May 1973, the final beam was bolted into place, making it the tallest building in the world at 1,450 feet. Office workers and school children craned their necks from sidewalks, tracking the slow ascent of the cranes. An iron worker remembered that you would look down and see the city like a map, and that up there the wind never stopped. Construction was a choreography of risk and routine. Crews rode open elevators to dizzying heights, lunchboxes swinging from calloused hands. Every morning, foremen barked orders over the clang of steel, and the city's rhythm echoed in the pulse of pneumatic hammers. From street level, the towers seemed to grow overnight, casting longer shadows across the Loop. The skyline became a symbol of confidence, a message in glass and steel that Chicago would not be outdone. For those who built it, the memory lingers, the shudder of girders underfoot, the taste of grit in the air, and the quiet pride of knowing their work would stand for generations. The city's horizon was no longer a limit, but a promise, reaching higher with every beam set in place. On the south side, Bronzeville's streets came alive each Sunday morning with the sound of church bells and neighbors greeting one another on their way to services. Stained glass windows cast colored light onto faces that had known each other for generations. Parish halls filled with the smell of coffee and sweet rolls, while elders swapped stories from Mississippi or Arkansas, their voices mixing with the laughter of children running between pews. The corner barber knew every name on the block, and the corner store kept credit open for regulars who might be short until payday. In Pilsen, Spanish flowed from open doorways, mingling with the scent of fresh tortillas and the bright splash of murals on brick walls. Families gathered at storefront bakeries for pan dulce, and the parish steps became a meeting ground after Mass. On the northwest and southwest sides, Polish delis displayed rows of sausage and rye bread behind fogged glass, while old-timers played chess outside social clubs, their conversations shifting between English and Polish with practiced ease. Each neighborhood carried its own rhythm: Bronzeville's gospel choirs, Pilsen's mariachi bands, the polka beats drifting from banquet halls on Milwaukee Avenue. These were places where identity was built block by block, where the world felt both small and secure. A store owner in Pilsen remembered, by 1975 the neighborhood was changing, but you still knew every face that walked in. We sold giardiniera for Italian beef, pierogi for the old-timers, and tamales for the new families. Church bells every evening, that was the sound of home. In these enclaves, pride ran deep, and the boundaries of belonging were as clear as the parish steps or the corner store awning. The shift whistle at the Calumet Mills cut through the afternoon sharp and final. In that moment, thousands of men, faces streaked with sweat and steel dust, filed out past the gates, boots crunching on gravel. The whistle carried a simple instruction to go home. A steelworker remembered that when the whistle blew at 3, you grabbed your lunch pail, wiped the grit from your hands, and joined the river of men heading for the bus stop or the tavern. The paycheck was steady. You could count on it. Union jobs in the mills and factories meant $15 or $20 an hour, a wage that put food on the table, bought a bungalow for $35,000, and sent kids to Catholic school. Those jobs were the backbone of many households, and they made possible everyday security. The rhythm was relentless. 8 hours on, 8 off, with the whistle marking every start and finish. In the break rooms, men played cards, swapped stories, and talked shop. Out on the floor, the noise was constant, furnaces roaring, presses stamping, forklifts beeping as they moved steel coils through the bays. In Rockford, Belvedere, and along the Fox River, the pattern held: punch in, work your shift, punch out. The pride in that routine ran deeper than the pay stub. For many, the factory was not just a job, it was the anchor for an entire way of life. That reliable wage powered more than a household. It fueled dreams of a new car in the driveway, a vacation at Wisconsin Dells, or a move to the growing suburbs. The sound of that whistle carried farther than anyone realized, echoing into every corner of Illinois, shaping what was possible for a generation. Rush hour on the Eisenhower meant a slow crawl past endless rows of brake lights, the city skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror. Out in the suburbs, new homes filled old cornfields, each cul-de-sac promising space and quiet. Naperville and Schaumburg grew mile by mile, stitched together by ribbons of concrete. Saturdays brought a different routine. Families piled into station wagons for the drive to Woodfield Mall, which opened in 1971 as one of the country's largest shopping centers. The air inside buzzed with muzak and the smell of pretzels, kids trailing behind parents through department stores and arcades. For many, life moved in a loop: commute, work, return, repeat. The suburbs offered a kind of order measured in lawns mowed and groceries hauled, but also a fatigue, each day defined by the distance between where you lived and where you had to be. Harvest season downstate began with the low rumble of combines at sunrise, engines churning through fields of corn and soybeans that stretched for miles. By the 1970s, nearly every farm relied on these machines: John Deere and International Harvester, each one able to clear a dozen acres in a day. Grain elevators stood like sentinels on the horizon, their silos filling fast as trucks lined up along gravel roads, waiting to unload. A farmer from McLean County recalled, "You watched the weather, you watched the marts, but mostly you watched the clock. When the crop was ready, you ran until the field was bare." After long days, small towns gathered for church suppers or VFW potlucks, tables crowded with casseroles, jello salads, and homemade pies. Potluck etiquette mattered. Who brought what? Who served first? A quiet choreography that tied neighbors together. In these moments, the taste of sweet corn or fresh baked bread was more than food. It was a reminder of shared work and independence, a flavor that belonged to the season and the place. Illinois still holds a mirror to America's divides: urban and rural, ambition and tradition, shaped by where you stand. Even now, state lines can't erase the boundaries we draw in daily life. The question is, do we notice where we belong or only where we don't? Thanks for watching.